So, in today's lecture, we are going to discuss the basic concepts of economics. And to start with, we shall give a lot of time to discuss the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics. I told you that most of the people who do not study economics or who have not studied economics, they always think that economics is all about micro and macro, and there is nothing else. But again, for your information, whoever specializes in economics, they study more than micro and macroeconomics. And there are different other disciplines, like we have public finance, then we have growth and development, then we have international trade, then we have financial economics, then we have institutional economics, and so on. We have Indian economy. So many papers are there, and depending upon the availability of the faculty members, different universities or different colleges offer
Sir,
different.
audio asune.
Audio Asuni? Is everyone facing the same problem?
Yes,
Sir, yeah.
sir, your voice is clearly audible. Your voice is clearly audible.
Okay. So maybe the officers who are not getting the audio, there might be some problem at your end. So please check your device, and maybe you should increase the volume, or you can use some earphone. But generally, if you find any problem, please let me know, okay, so that I can change the device. Today I have logged in from my laptop, but my desktop is also open, so I can move to the desktop. But yeah, most of are telling that the audio is clear to all of you. Okay. So I was telling that in economics, we have so many other subjects, but why we start with this distinction between the micro and macro? Because this is the larger, broader approach that economists follow. And it's not that only we study micro and macroeconomics. So the basic difference that we can start with is that when we say micro, as the name itself says, it deals with the smaller entities, okay, or it deals with the individual entities. Okay, and basically, we discuss the behavior of the consumer, the behavior of the producer. See, you and I are either consumers or producers. See, now, when I am talking to you, I am a producer because I am producing knowledge, okay? And I am distributing to all of you. And of course, you are getting this knowledge for free because you are going through for this training. And of course, your institute will pay me. So I am getting a price for that. So I am producing something and I am selling to you. And so basically, your Madhusudan Academy is now buying my services, and that I'm producing now, and that is being transferred to all of you. So I'm a producer now. All of you are now consumers because you are consuming my knowledge, and it might add value to you, or it may not add value to you. Some of you might be getting utility. Some of you might be getting disutility also. If the class becomes boring, then it creates disutility. Okay? And if you are enjoying it, then you are getting utility. Okay, so the consumer gets the utility from the product, from the commodity or the services, and the producer produces. Now, in microeconomics, when we deal with the consumers and producers, we basically discuss how the consumer will maximize the utility, basically on the satisfaction. If I get into the technical definitions of utility, you will all feel bored, and that will become a formal classroom teaching. So I am not going to do that. But if any time you want to know any concept, please ask me, so that I can explain in details. So the consumers basically try to maximize their utility, and so they have an objective function and they have a constraint. Now, what is the objective function? Objective function is to maximize the utility or the satisfaction. So why we buy a commodity? Because it gives us certain utility, okay? And that is why we spend some money and we buy that commodity. Now, that is our objective function. That when you go to market, you discuss or you take a decision in your back of your mind that what all commodities I will buy from the market, so that my utility is maximized. Okay? And now, what is the constraint? Your constraint is your money, your budget. Okay? That is your income. Okay? So, objective function. So, for a consumer, there is an objective function, and there is a constant. And objective function is to maximize utility, and utility is a function of all the commodities that you are buying from the market. and your constant is the income that you have. Basically, that the disposable income you have. That means after payment of tax, whatever income you are earning per month, that is your disposable income. That is a constant, and we try to maximize that. And we always say that our mother is the best economist because she manages the family, and so she always looks at the price of the commodity. And when we go to market, or when we were kids and my mother sends us to the market with a bag, she tells, okay, you buy these commodities, because she's also aware of the prices. And so we buy the commodities accordingly. And so, for example, when I am a very typical consumer, when I go to market, I look at the prices of the vegetables, and if the price of certain vegetable exceeds a limit, I do not buy those vegetables. For example, I have absolutely zero utility from brinjal. Okay, I buy vegetable. I buy brinjal for my wife only because she loves brinjal. Okay, but if the price of the brinjal exceeds say 30 or 40 rupees, I do not buy, because I believe that no, it is too much of price, and I will not get any utility. If at all my wife gets some certainly utility, and paying 40 rupees is not worth. Similarly, onion. I buy onion up to a certain price, say maximum 30 or 40 rupees. If the onion price exceeds 40 rupees, I do not buy, because I believe that I do not get any utility which is worth 40 rupees that is coming from the onion. So we take a decision. Okay, so in fact, when there are multiple commodities that we buy from the market, we always do some analysis in our mind. Of course, you do not go with a calculator that how much utility you are getting from which vegetable, and know how much money you are spending. You don't do that calculation, but definitely we do some analysis, and that is taught in a very formal manner in the economics classes. Now coming to the producer has a more challenging job, because producer has to produce different commodities. So the producer has to decide how many, what commodity he or she will produce, now what will the quantity of the production, what all factors of production will be employed so that he or she can maximize the profit. Now product differentiation. So a lot of things are there in the producer's behavior, because producer's objective is either to maximize profit or to minimize the cost. So those things are discussed in microeconomics. In the counterpart, if you look at the macroeconomics, we look at the total production in the economy. And when you say total production in the economy, that is basically GDP, gross domestic product. Or if you look at the state, then it is gross state domestic product, or you can say this is the national income. So all those things will be discussed in macroeconomics. Now, so I told you that in utility we discussed in consumer behavior, or in microeconomics we discuss the utility, we discuss the profit maximization, what commodity to produce, what quantity to be produced, and what should be the selling price of the commodity, and the quantity of factors of production to be deployed. When you say factors of production in economics, then this is very technical language or jargon we are using for the for all the inputs that is used for production. And what all inputs are used? The first one is the labor, okay? Or you can say land, because on the land you need to set up your factory. And then we have a certain amount of labors, and then we employ land, labor, capital. And so capital means all the machineries will be included in that, and organization, basically the entrepreneur who is doing all these things, who is bringing all the factors of production together. And of course, along with that, we also use a lot of raw materials. Okay? So when you say quantity of factors of production to employ to get certain output, or to maximize profit, or to minimize cost, so all these things are discussed in microeconomics. But on the other hand, in macroeconomics, we deal with the macro pictures, okay? And we do not deal with the individual people. We deal with the macro pictures. And if in microeconomics you talk about the individual utility maximization, in macroeconomics we discuss the welfare maximization. Okay? And if you remember, Professor Amartya Sen has got Nobel Prize for his contribution in the field of welfare economics. And in fact, if you put it in a broader picture, that is coming under theory of public choice. And again, for your information, we have an eminent economist from Odisha who is a student of Professor Amartya Sen. I don't know whether you are aware of his name. He is Professor Prashant Patnaik, Prashant Kumar Patnaik. He is from Odisha. Now he is a professor of graduate division at University of California. Why I'm giving all these names? Because his contribution to the field of welfare economics or theory of public choice is immense. And in fact, Professor Amartya Sen, if you listen to his Nobel lecture, basically, when you get the Nobel Prize, when you receive the prize, you have to give an acceptance lecture. And in that lecture, he has mentioned two names. One is Professor Prashant Patnaik, and other is Kaushik Basu. Kaushik Basu, all of you know him. So Amartya Sen acknowledges that it is because of Prashant Patnaik and Kaushik Basu, he started working in this field, and that's how he got Nobel Prize in the field of welfare economics, or say the theory of public choice. So in theory of public choice, we try to maximize the welfare of the people. And there are a lot of theories. I should tell you in a brief. See, now you are all officers. Okay? Now you all will be helping the government to maximize the welfare of the people. Okay? And so we always believe that the government who is elected by the people is representing the preferences of the individuals, and that is how they will try to maximize the welfare of the people subject to the budget constraint. So every year, you know that they present a budget, and they have certain limits, and then but the preference of the individuals are so diverse. So that is the problem they face. And in fact, there are a lot of theories in this, that how to maximize the welfare of the people. It's a very difficult proposition, and that's why an economist, who is again a Nobel laureate, his name is Kenneth Arrow. He has given a theory which is known as Arrow's impossibility theorem. He says that it is really difficult to maximize the welfare of the people. Why? Because see, how to maximize the welfare of the people? Basically, as I told, we elect the people, and the elected government rules us, or they serve us, and so we believe that they will represent the welfare of the people, or they will represent the preferences of the individuals, and that's how the welfare will be maximized. But Arrow says that under no form of government, when you say no form of government, that means you must be aware of different forms of government. One is the majority voting system. Now, the voting system that we follow in India to elect our representatives, that is called as majority voting system. Whoever gets the maximum votes is basically forming the government. But the other forms of government will be both the counting voting. Basically, if you look at the presidential election, we follow a both the count voting. Okay? That means you have to give preferences, preference 1, preference 2, preference 3, like that. And if in the first preference you are not able to elect somebody, then we have to go for the addition of the second preferences. So like that. So there are different other voting forms. So Arrow says that under no voting voting system, you will be able to aggregate the preferences of the individual of a country, and that's how you will not be able to maximize the welfare of the people. And that's what a democratic government faces. Okay, so those are all discussed in welfare economics, and or it is discussed in the theory of public choice. So that becomes a part of, say, microeconomics or macroeconomics or welfare economics, depending upon the specialization one university offers. But you should know that when I say welfare maximization, we deal with those challenges. Because you are no more students, you are all officers, so you'll be every day facing such problems. That you must think that government is taking a decision that does not really increase the welfare of the people. Rather, they are trying to maximize their votes, and for that also we have theories in economics. Now we have median voter theorems. Those are also taught in political science probably. Like why or what kind of approach a government follows to maximize the votes, and the conflict arises between maximizing the welfare of the people and maximizing the votes of the political party, so that they continue to rule the state or the nation. So these are the conflicts, that arises, and that those are also discussed in economics, and these are part of also, you can say, macroeconomics or welfare economics or theory of public choice. And again, when we say macro, it is not merely the summation of the micro. See, we all must be thinking that if in microeconomics we discuss the behavior of the individuals who are either consumers or producers, then if you just aggregate them, then you get macroeconomics. But it is not it is not like that. Just like the summation of trees is not equal to the forest, just like that, summation of micro is not equal to macro, and that's why we tell fallacy of composition. I will discuss that fallacy of composition in greater details in my next slide. But just remember that summation of micro is not equal to macro, and that is explained as the fallacy of composition. Then we discuss the national income, the gross domestic product, or gross state domestic product. Now, I'm not getting into these concepts here because I will be dealing with all these things in greater details, like what are the methodologies that is used to measure GDP, and what are the controversies involved in the measurement of GDP. And if you are again following newspaper, you must be aware that when Prime Minister Modi came to power, there was a lot of debate, going on the measurement of GDP. And some people also criticized, saying that now in the past we used to discuss that future is uncertain, okay, and because we do not know about the future. But under the present government, the past is uncertain. Okay? Now, why this comment has been given? Because see, I'm not endorsing any such comment. I'm just making you aware of such a certain these discussions. Because when you discuss in a classroom, we do not have any political color in the classroom. Okay? So this is only for the knowledge, or for your information. I'm telling you all these things. Why this criticism came? That usually people say that future is uncertain, but at present we say that the past is uncertain, because when the new government, basically it's not the government, basically the CSO released the new GDP series, it was observed that the growth measurements gave completely different pictures. Because when we use the old methodology to measure GDP, we saw that during UPA regime, on an average, the growth rate was higher than the growth rate that is being witnessed under NDA regime. And in fact, NDA won the present, the present NDA, we can say 1 and 2. And of course, if you take into the past, then NDA 2, 1, 2, 3, 4 will come. But we are considering the regime under Prime Minister Modi only. So if you take that, then the comparison came that, okay, the earlier, if you use the earlier GDP series, then it was showing that under Manmohan Singh's regime, the growth rate was higher. But when the new series came, it was observed that the growth rate is higher under Prime Minister Modi's regime, and the growth rate under Prime Minister Manmohan Singh regime was lower. So on that basis, people criticized that now the past is uncertain. So that was the context in which people use this criticism. And then in macroeconomics, we discuss the general prices level, or wholesale price index, or consumer price index, or the inflation. These are the subjects of macroeconomics. And similarly, we discuss the employment level or unemployment level. If you are again following debates in the media in the recent days, particularly after the lockdown, we are hearing very high rate of unemployment during this lockdown. And in fact, and the data says, I think yesterday I was reading reports in media. Now the CMI data shows, that is Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, which is giving data on the unemployment. It is basically saying that now after lockdown, more than 2 crore people have lost job. They precisely tell 1.8 crore. So I'm telling it's about 2 crore people have lost job. And in the month of July only, some 80 lakh people have lost job. Okay? So that is the implication. So in macroeconomics, we discuss all these things, like what is the rate of unemployment, what is the rate of unemployment, and what are the reasons behind unemployment, what are the consequences of unemployment, And so all these things are discussed in macroeconomics. Similarly, if you want to generate employment, what kind of policy you should adopt? In that context, we discuss the choice of techniques, like whether you should adopt a capital intensive technology, or you should adopt a labor intensive technology in a country like India, where we have abundant labors, and then we have a scarcity of the capital. Why I'm saying that there is a scarcity of capital? Because we are running after different countries basically to get capital, and that's how we are going to different countries. Our prime minister visits different countries. Our ministers from Odisha also visit different other countries to attract foreign direct investment. And so that's why I'm telling that we are basically we are facing the scarcity of the capital, but we have abundance of labor. So that gives the difficult choice whether you should adopt a labor intensive technology or you should adopt a capital intensive technology. In fact, that was the work of Professor Amartya Sen. His PhD work was basically choice of techniques, but in latter stage of his research academic career, he changed his discipline and he started working on welfare economics. Okay, then comes aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So in microeconomics, we discuss the individual, the demand for individual commodities, but in macroeconomics, we discuss the demand for the aggregate demand. Okay, so somebody is raising a question, so you can go ahead, you can unmute and ask question. Mr.
Yes, sir.
Rajendra Nayak, yes.
Yes, sir. Sir, one small question. Sir,
Please.
what is the difference between previous GDP measurement method and present GDP measurement method? Can you elaborate a little?
Yeah, I told you that in fact, when I was looking at the syllabus, we'll focus one lecture on GDP measurement. Okay, so for timing, you can wait. Okay, because that will otherwise that will be repetition. So let us focus on the things that we are now discussing, and there will be full lecture on the GDP measurement, the controversies. Okay? Yeah, so yeah, we can wait for some time. Now, in macroeconomics, we discuss the aggregate demand and then aggregate supply, and yeah, these are the subjects of these are the differences between micro and macro. Now, since I told you that in macroeconomics we discuss the concept of inflation, I am going to basically discuss some of these things here. Now, what do you mean by inflation? Okay. Similarly, what do you mean by WPI, CPI? How are these things measured? Okay. So we shall discuss in brief here. But remember, again, on inflation, there are we can have a special session on inflation. Here, I am only telling you only the brief introduction to inflation, because when we discuss inflation, we discuss types of inflation, the causes of inflation, the consequences of inflation, how to control inflation. So all these things will come. But in this lecture, I am discussing only the concept, because since we are discussing the macroeconomy, and that is why I am only focusing on the concept. I am not getting into the details of inflation, but we can have special discussion on inflation. Now, what is inflation? It is basically persistent and persistent and perceptible rise in persistent and perceptible rise in the prices. Okay? That means if the price rises continuously, and if the price rise is a sizable amount, then only we call it as inflation. If the price rises only a little bit and for only say 1 month, similarly if the price rises only for some commodities, not for all the commodities, then we do not consider it as inflation. In fact, if you are following the monetary policy of the Reserve Bank of India, in fact, anyone can go to Reserve Bank of India website and just see, there is an icon on monetary policy. You just click on that, you will find details of the monetary policy, like how the monetary policy, what are the instruments of monetary policy, how how the Reserve Bank controls inflation. All those things are there. So why I'm mentioning all that? It is mentioned now. The Reserve Bank of India Act has been amended and RBI Act 1934 has been amended in the year 2016. Now, as per the new amendment, Government of India has said that now to control inflation, it is not the RBI governor alone controls inflation. There is a monetary policy committee which is entrusted the responsibility of controlling inflation. Now they will be considered that they have failed in their duty to control inflation only if the prices exceed certain limit more than in 3 quarters. So if suppose the price exceeds the limit given target in 1 quarter or 2 quarters, that will not be considered as a failure of the monetary policy committee in controlling inflation. If it exceeds only more than 3 quarters, then only government will ask that no, you have failed. The government will held the monetary policy committee responsible and say that you have failed in controlling inflation. So no, why I'm using this word definition for you that we will consider a price rise as inflation only if it is persisting for some time, okay? And it is a sizable, perceptible. So it has to be persistent and it has to be perceptible rise in price. Then only it will be called as inflation. Now, inflation is measured through 2 indices. One is wholesale price index and other is consumer price index. Now, what is wholesale price index? No, it basically reflects the change in the average prices for bulk sale of commodities at the first stage of transaction. Basically, we take the prices, we take the wholesale prices to measure the to construct the price index. Similarly, when we look at the consumer price index, we take the prices that is paid by the consumer, and we all know that there is a difference between the wholesale price and the price that is paid by the consumer, or you can say a retail price and another is the wholesale price. And always, which price will be higher? Obviously, the consumer price. Okay, because the consumer pays a higher price that includes the taxation, that includes the transportation cost. Okay, so the retail prices or the prices paid by the consumer is always higher. So CPI will be mostly higher than the WPI. But when you look at the changes in the prices, we cannot draw any conclusion because that depends upon the base that you are using. Okay? So if your base is already high, then your inflation will be lower, be it WPI or be it CPI. So that is the difference between WPI and CPI. Now, how many commodities are used in WPI? 697 commodities are included in the wholesale price index. And in consumer price index also the same number of commodities will be there. Only difference will be the prices. In case of WPI, the prices will be lower, and in case of consumer price index, the prices will be little higher. Now I can give you some idea like how these are constructed, how we construct an index. I should have ideally kept a slide actually how is this index constructed, but I will give you some idea. Okay? So just look at this table. This basically gives you some idea like what are the changes that has happened between the WPI 2004-5 and the WPI 2011-12. In fact, this is basically gives a reference to the base year that we are using. Okay? And like somebody was asking that what is the basic difference between the earlier measurement and the new measurement? One is the base year. Now, for any price index, we consider a base year. Now, again, you must be thinking, what is a base year? We select a base year, basically that is a normal year. And see, when we are comparing the prices, you have to consider the base year with reference to certain year you are comparing. So, for example, our grandmother or our parents, they tell that when our parents got married, the price of gold for 10 gram was 1,000 rupees. So they tell all the stories that we bought gold only when the price was only 1,000 rupees per 10 gram, and now it is 40,000 rupees or more than 40,000 rupees. Now there we take a comparison that okay, so our father's wedding year and our wedding year. That's how we compare. So the base year will become the father's wedding year. Now if you compare our grandmother's wedding year and father's or our parents' wedding year and our wedding year, so again the base year changes, right? So compared to my grandmother's wedding year, in my wedding year, the gold price has increased so much. Okay, so like that. So you have to keep a benchmark against which you are comparing the prices and the changes in the prices. So that is why we take a base year, and the base year has to be always a normal year. There should not be any war. There should not be any major floods or disasters, or the prices should not have increased very high. So it should be a very normal. Your monsoon should be normal, so that your agricultural products are also normal in the entire country. So that's how we choose a base year. And so the new GDP series that we are using, that uses basically the base year 2011-12. Now why a base year is also changed? One is that from time to time we get new commodities in the market. So if you are using the old index, then that index will not be able to capture the new commodities that have come to your market. So for example, a new smartphone, which is available in 2011-12, that did not exist in 1980, okay, or in 1970. So if you are comparing, if you are using a base year in 1970, and you are trying to construct the price index or try to measure the inflation in the year 2020, then you will not be able to measure the real changes in the prices, because your basket is not including all the commodities that is available in the market. Similarly, all the services, that also has to be included in this basket. Now, there are many services that are coming up in the recent years, which did not exist in the past. So that is why also we change the base year from time to time, so that in our basket we can include all the commodities in our basket while measuring the index. That is observed here. We can say that measure groups. So if you say all commodities, the weight is 100, and then primary articles, we had 20% share, but now in 2011-12, primary articles have a higher weight, that is 22.62% share. Similarly, fuel and power, they had 13.91% share. Now they have a lesser weight. When I say weight in the price index, in fact, okay. Somebody is asking any question? Please go ahead.
Yes. Just one question, sir. The base year you are showing us 2011-12, that is the latest base year that you are following?
Yes, that is the latest base year we are following. Yes.
So, sir, there were some changes that the current government wanted to make with 2016-17 as the new base year. So, we have not implemented that yet.
No, we have not yet implemented. Yes.
Okay.
So maybe that will be implemented sometime soon in the future. But as of now, we are using the base year 2011-12. Yeah. In fact, okay. So fine. So let us focus on this slide, because on GDP anyway, I will have more discussion on that. So now when we are measuring the price index, particularly WPI or CPI, we have these grouping of the commodities. One is the primary articles, then we have fuel and power, and then we have manufactured products. And now you will see that the primary articles have got a little higher weightage from 20 to 22.62, and manufactured products, of course, has the highest share, that is 64.23, which was a little higher in the past, that is 64.97. See, all these things will change the weights. Okay, I should tell you also now what is the formula that we use to construct the price index. I am telling you that this is an index. Now we have how many commodities? We have 697 commodities. Now to construct an index, the formula that we can use is, okay, for 697 commodities, there will be 697 prices. Now, can we simply add those prices and take the mean price of all the commodities? Can we do that? There are 697 commodities, and now to get the average price, can we simply add those commodities price and divide it by n? Can you do that?
No, sir.
We cannot. We cannot, because yeah, because different commodities will have different levels of prices. Some prices are very high, some prices are very low. Some commodities will have a very high share in the market. Some commodities have a very low share in the market. So that is why we have been, no, in fact, we had been using that simple weighted average, okay, or the weighted arithmetic mean used to be used till 2010-11. Okay. Now in the new base year, we are using the weighted geometric mean. Okay. So, and again for your information, before independence, we used to follow that weighted geometric mean, but after independence, we again came back to the weighted arithmetic mean. And why we came back to weighted arithmetic mean? Because we believe, no, we felt that the number of commodities are now increasing. So if you use weighted geometric mean, then its calculation becomes very much complicated. And we know that in 1950s or 60s, we did not have a computer in this country. Okay? And the computer came quite late. So it would have become very difficult to estimate the weighted geometric mean. But now from 2011-12 onwards, we have been using this weighted geometric mean, and that is a scientific formula, and that is used internationally, because that now computers have come, we can do that estimation very easily. Now, and again, why this kind of distinction is given the primary articles, fuel and power, manufactured products? It will give you idea. It will give you some idea. Basically, we use a concept called core inflation. In core inflation, yes.
Sir, one doubt.
Yeah,
Sir,
please ask.
weighted arithmetic mean and weighted geometric mean.
Yes.
So, which of them? Suppose there is some change in number of variables, then weighted geometric mean may give a more error than weighted arithmetic mean, I think. So if we compare both of them, because sir, if you take two variables and change each of them by some decimals, then if we calculate the arithmetic mean, weighted arithmetic mean and weighted geometric mean, then weighted geometric mean is going to deviate more than weighted arithmetic mean, because it is multiplication. So in case of multiplication, it's going to give more error. So rather we should have gone for weighted arithmetic mean, which would be giving less error. Limiting error will.
I understand your point, but no, we are using currently the weighted geometric mean, and the reason could be that internationally this is followed, and so India is also following that. Okay? See, again for your information, I should tell you that whatever measurements India follows, that is based on the international practices. And who gives that? That is basically given by the United Nations System of National Accounts, UNSNA. Okay? So United Nations System of National Accounts, that gives the formula that internationally what method we should follow for our national income accounting. And that is why since we follow a common method internationally, these GDP numbers are comparable. You can compare GDP of India with other countries. Of course, sometimes we also question, say, the GDP measurement of China. Similarly, we also question the GDP measurement of some other countries. But by and large, most of the countries follow one uniform method. And since this is being followed internationally, we are using this. And that error thing, I'll have to check, and again I'll probably give you some answer in my next lecture. Okay, on this. Yes, please go ahead. Yes,
sir. Sir, so since what time UNSNA adopted this weighted geometric mean for calculation of GDP?
For prices, that I will again tell you from which year this 2000 geometric weighted geometric mean has been used by UNSNA. That I'll have to check. But in India, we have implemented it from the year 2011-12.
Yes, sir. So actually, one thing, because we study this statistics, all these things. So in case of limiting error, so I was telling about limiting error. In case of multiplication, the limiting errors percentage are added directly, and in case of addition, that is average method, we take the standard deviation. We add the standard deviation. Exactly, I'm not able to remember, but we add the standard deviation. In case of multiplication, that is geometric mean, we directly add the limiting errors. So in case of, if we are adding one more variable, then we are adding along with it the error associated with it. So directly the error accumulates. In case of addition, that doesn't seem to happen.
Okay, so I'll have to know, inquire more about it, and basically what are the limitations that we face in case of the weighted geometric mean and weighted arithmetic mean, in particularly while measuring the price index, and that we can discuss in the next class. Okay.
Yes, sir. Okay.
Yeah. So, but thank you for the questions. So that it basically helps me to again do more exploration and get back to the students and our in this case to the officers here. Okay, fine. So now here the number of items are mentioned, and now the number of quotations. That will basically know how many samples are collected from different countries. Because when you say the prices of one commodity, we collect the prices of these commodities from different locations. That's when we get different prices for the rural area, for the urban area, for the construction workers, for the agricultural workers. Okay, so like that, we have different price indices. So now the number of quotations also have increased from 5,482 to 8,331. Okay, and now the number of basket commodities have also increased in this price index. Now the next one is the fallacy of composition, and since I use this terminology in my explanation when I was talking about the difference between micro and macro, we should know this. What is fallacy of composition? So if you look at the definition of this fallacy of composition, then it says something which is true for individual might not be true for the whole. Okay, just like I told, the summation of trees is not equal to the forest. And the examples given are the paradox of thrift. What is this paradox of thrift? That we should know. So being thrift is good or bad? Again, that depends upon the ideological position we have. Okay? And now some people will say that being thrift is good. Some people will say that being thrift is bad. And so in fact, in India, we have the Charbak's principle. Okay? Charbak has said, Jabam jivate sukham jivate, runam krutta grutam pivate. So no, always live happily. Doesn't matter if you have to borrow for that. That is also fine. Okay? So that is Charbak's principle. But many people believe that to save your future, the uncertainty of the future, you need to have more savings. Okay? And because if you do not get income in the future, and now that you all belong to a generation where there is no pension, we all belong to the new pension scheme regime, we all need to save a lot of money so that our future will remain certain. But if everyone in the country saves, what will be the impact? Now, if everybody saves, basically there will be no demand in the market. So saving is good for the individuals. Also, if you save too much of money individually, that is fine. But if everyone in the country saves too much of money, then that is a bad thing. Okay? Because the aggregate demand in the country will collapse. Now, if nobody goes to the market, which is happening in the present time during this lockdown, hardly we are buying anything from the market. We are buying only the basic necessities, only the vegetables or fruits that we are buying for our things. Now, during this lockdown, the Savitra Amasya, then Rajo, so many festivals have gone. Akshaya Tritiya, no, we saw that hardly any gold was sold. Okay? And similarly, we saw that during Rajo and Savitri, very few people went to market. The market was not really crowded. So now all of us are saving. Of course, there is also a loss of income, but generally the saving has increased. But if it happens throughout the year by every individual, then that is a problem. since we are discussing this point, I will give you. In fact, in economics, we discuss the concept marginal propensity to consume, okay, and marginal propensity to save. That means basically what percentage of income you are saving. That is called marginal propensity to save. Or basically when the income changes by 1%, how is your saving changing? Similarly, when your income increases by 1%, how is your consumption changing? That is called as marginal propensity to consume. Now, why I'm using these things? Now, for your growth, your marginal propensity to consume matters a lot. If your marginal propensity to consume is higher, then your multiplier effect will be higher. That means if you are spending 1 rupee, so if the government spends say 100 rupees, then that money goes to the people. Now, if the people put that all the money in the bank, then multiplier effect does not operate. But when government gives 100 rupees, now say the money was spent for MGNRG's program. Now all the people who are holding a job card, they got that 100 rupees. Now they all will go to market, fish market, and the demand for fish is increasing because of MGNRGs. So now the fish seller will not keep that money. Fish seller will also buy some other vegetables. Okay? And so then vegetable production is increasing, fish production is increasing. So that is basically the multiplier effect. But if all the job card holders who got 100 rupees, they all will put that money in the bank, then the fish seller cannot sell fish, the vegetable seller cannot sell vegetables. So the multiplier effect stops at that point. So if you want the multiplier effect to be higher, the marginal propensity to consume should be higher. But again, if the marginal propensity to consume is too high, that is also a bad thing. In fact, if you compare the growth rates of India, China, and Japan, now we are lagging far behind Japan and China. But if you look at the per capita income of China, Japan, and India in the year 1947, we are almost at equal level. Now, why there is so much of difference between China, India, and Japan, and South Korea? South Korea also had similar situation like India. But China, now South Korea is a developed country. China, of course, is still a developing country. But Japan is a developed country. So what are the differences? Now, if you go back to the history and compare the saving rates of these countries in 1947, then China and Japan had a very high rate of saving. Okay? And why saving is required? Unless you have saving, you cannot invest anywhere. If you cannot invest, you cannot generate any employment. Now, income generation will be low, tax generation will also be low. So that has its own, again, saving has its own multiplier effect also, which is called as investment multiplier. Okay? That if 1 rupee is invested somewhere, then it also adds to the investment elsewhere. Okay? So China, Japan, and India had similar rate of per capita income, but in terms of savings, we had very different scenario. Now, if you ask you this question, can you guess what was the saving rate of India in 1950? Write your answer in the message box. Just guess. But don't do a Google search. Okay, just give your answer. Just any guess that you can make. What was the rate of saving of India in 1950 without doing a Google search? Can you make any guess? It was around 11%. Okay, it was around 11%. But during that time, yes. Tell me, somebody is telling something.
I said only 11%.
Yes. Rate of saving of India was only around 11%. But if you look at the saving rate of China and Japan during 1947 or 50, it was more than 40%. Okay. Of course, now if you take the saving rate of India, now we are saving more. Okay? And in fact, the saving rates have started increasing from 1990 onwards. Okay? Because our income started growing and we started saving more, and our saving rate and investment rates were the highest in 2011. And our capital, basically our investment rate was about 39% in 2011, and our saving rate was more than 36%, or around 37%. So our saving rates have increased from 11% in 1950 to 37% in 2011. Now, of course, it has again declined a little bit. I must be thinking why investment rate is higher than the saving rate, because we get foreign direct investment. Okay, so the 2% extra that is invested in our country is coming from the other countries. Okay, so it is, that's why you will always find the investment rate is always higher than the saving rate. Okay, and after 2011, the investment rate has declined steadily. It has now fallen to almost 31% or even below 30%. So anyway, so the number that I was giving, that the saving rates have gone up. So saving for an individual is a virtue, but if everyone saves all the income, so there are some misers also, right? So when people earn too much of money, they become miser. They don't spend anything, and they save all the money, and so that is a bad situation. And because as I told, that multiplier effect will go down, and particularly the demand multiplier, and that's how the aggregate demand will collapse, and the productions will also collapse. So there will be no new employment, new investment will not take place, and that's how the economy will collapse. That is called as paradox of thrift. Similarly, there is another tragedy of commons. Now, what is this tragedy of commons? You must be aware of these things, but formally, I don't know whether you know this. What is tragedy of commons? So in the village, we have grazing lands, okay? And when we buy cows, we believe that, okay, so there is a free grazing land, and when we buy more and more cows, we'll get more milk, okay? And we do not worry about the grazing land condition. Now, this is, everyone in the village thinks similarly. And so everyone tries to get more and more number of cows. And when the number of cows exceed the limit, the grazing land is completely destroyed. Okay? So because if the grazing land can give grass to say only 100 cows, but if the number of cows are 1,000, then if all those 1,000 cows go to that grazing land, what will happen? That grazing land will be completely destroyed, okay? Because we are putting extra burden on the grazing land, and the regeneration of grass is less than the extraction rate of the grass. So that's how the grassland will be completely destroyed. That is called as tragedy of the commons, because the grassland is a common land that is used by everyone, and the same thing happens in a village forest. So that we see that everyone goes to the forest thinking that I will get the best tree available in the forest, okay, and that's how we got it. And so everyone goes to the forest, and ultimately at the end of the month, the entire forest is cleared. Similarly, in the ocean, the trawlers go to the ocean for deep fishing, deep sea fishing, and they use the net that completely basically catches all kind of fishes. And we also get the statistics that very precious varieties of fishes are now extincted completely. They do not exist because of this trawling. The trawlers that we are using, mechanized fishing, has destroyed the fish population in the sea. And why is it happening? Because of lack of regulation. That is called as tragedy of commons. So every individual thinks to maximize his or her own benefit, but the result is the common destruction. Okay? And similarly, so this is basically called as the fallacy of composition. And there are also many other examples that can be given. Basically, we can give the example of free rider, that we think that we can cheat somebody, and other people cannot find us, and everyone thinks like that. I can give the example of, since we are discussing this free riding problem, you all might have heard the story of king who wanted to make a milk pond. Okay, have you all heard of this story from your grandfather or father? Okay, let me tell you that story very quickly. So once one king wanted to make a milk pond. So what he did, he announced in the kingdom that okay, we are going to dig a pond, but that pond will be unique. It will not have water; it will be full of milk only. So for that, all the subjects of the kingdom will have to pour milk in that milk pond, in that pond. Okay? So a pond was dug by the people of the kingdom, and then the king decided it is only on the new moon night uh, uh, all the people will have to pour milk in that pond, so that in the morning the king will see that the pond is full of milk. So because that was the auspicious night, okay, that was decided, and all the people went and poured whatever they carried in the pond. And in the morning, king went to that pond to see, and he saw the pond was filled full of water. There was not even a drop of milk in that pond. Now, why did this happen? Because every subject in the kingdom thought that all the people in the kingdom will be carrying milk. If I take only one bucket of water, no one can catch me. Okay? And king will only see a milk pond. So when the king, and in fact, what happened? Every individual in the country, in the kingdom, carried water only. Nobody carried milk. So this is called as free riding problem. You believe that others will contribute, I will only get a free ride. I will not pay for anything because carrying water is basically you are not contributing anything. You are getting the benefit for free. Had it been if all the people had carried milk and only some 5-10 people had carried water, then king would have seen a milk pond only, and all the credit would have gone to all the subjects, but that did not happen. So this is a typical problem of free riding, and that is also the example that you can extend to any public property. You see in your village when there is, or even in cities, a tap is broken, water would be flowing. No one repairs that tap. Okay, that tap would cost hardly 100 rupees. Okay, but no one dares even to repair that tap. Why? Because we all believe that if I spend 100 rupees, all others will get the benefit. So why should I spend 100 rupees? If everyone is getting the benefit, I should not spend that. I should not take all the cost. So the cost has to be shared also. Okay, so that's why we do not repair. That is also an example of the free riding. So this is basically called as the fallacy of composition. So, and that's why whatever is true for the individual is not true for the whole. Okay? And that is the difference between micro and macro. So with this, I will stop here.